All right. All right, people, grab some pizza. We're gonna start in about a minute. Wonderful spring inaugural dungeon learn.
Like these new screens are very weird.
No, I'm in front of her.
The screens are weird.
How come looking up?
It's a little much to see yourself.
It's very weird.
Blocking the whole view.
I think that,
When we have to see yourself back there, because I'm
yeah,
gonna.
can we can change that. That's just awkward.
No, we have to stare at
But
yourself.
When I change that. It's making me self-conscious. I'm self-conscious.
You want to be recording or, yeah.
All right. Let's get this show on the road. Welcome, everyone. This is our inaugural spring lunch and learn, and we are really pleased and honored to have our very own Dr. Mirra, who is an associate professor of urban and teacher education and is constantly striving to bring the two fields of literacy and youth civic engagement together in ways that bring about more social change and justice in classrooms and society. She began her career teaching high school English in Brooklyn, New York, and was struck, as many of us are, by the inequities that were perpetuated in classrooms, and was inspired to leverage critical literacy practices as a force to challenge them. So rather than just focusing on content alone, Dr. Mirra believes that content should be used as a vehicle to teach students to lift their voices in public life. And she partners with youth and co-researchers in work and co-design studies focused on issues that students care about. Dr. Mirra pursued English during her undergraduate years at NYU and went on to receive 2 masters in English education and education policy from education policy and management from Harvard University. She later pursued her PhD from the University of California in urban schooling. And in addition to engaging in research and teaching courses in English education, Dr. Mirra works with the New York City Department of Education to analyze middle school debate programming. She also participates in the National Writing Project, which works with teachers across the country to encourage civically engaged writing with young people. In partnerships with the Writing Project and Teachers College Press, she published a book on what it means to bring empathy to classrooms through more critical civic way. And she is the recipient of the prestigious Spencer National Academy's Postdoctoral Fellow, and has recently edited a special issue, which I hope you will plug, on speculative education in the Journal of the Learning Sciences. So without further ado, my pleasure. Dr. Mirra.
Thanks, everybody. I did a brown bag talk here, I think a little over 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and I had just finished collecting data for the project that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today. And it's over the past 2.5 years, this project led me to develop these ideas about speculative education that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, and that have kind of led to the JLS issue, to the ARJ piece that you read, as well as some conferences in the field. So it's been really interesting to see how people are taking that up. I just wanted to kind of go over again, like kind of how I came to those ideas. But thank you, Ruby, and thank you everybody for being here. I actually wrote this out because I know that I'm gonna get off track. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is interrogating this concept of civic education. It conjures very specific associations for many of us. We often think about civic education from a normative perspective as a bounded subject area in schools. Perhaps you took a social studies class in your senior year or at some point during schooling, which was a civic education course. As an ELA teacher and as someone who works in community settings, I've always resisted this understanding of civics as something that happens in one subject area, in one particular bounded area in schools. But I also don't want to cede control of the word civic education or the word civic. So in my work, I strive for an expansive understanding of civic education as a feature of learning across settings and disciplines. So to explain this in a little bit more depth, I argue that civic education in school contexts within the United States, which is going to be the focus of my work, the United States context, is largely conceptualized as a discrete academic content area and seeks to instill within students knowledge and dispositions to maintain the infrastructure of the nation state. So as a result, I see it as inherently a project of power and control by those in dominant positions of social power. In the US case, this involves erasing the sovereignty of the occupied indigenous lands that we stand upon and privileging the identities, values, and forms of participation that serve white landowning men as the foundation of liberal democracy. Widening the umbrella to include more communities in the nation state can be seen as a manifestation of interest convergence, if we're talking about critical race theory, which I'm happy to talk about more later. So the term civic has become so enmeshed in this paradigm that many people who approach this work from more sociocultural perspectives actually don't like to use it at all, because civic just gets associated with this project that they don't want to be part of. So oftentimes we talk about sociocultural or sociopolitical learning to break free of the grounding of the nation state and highlight the ways that youth are forging multifaceted identities and agency within a variety of communities, expansively understood. So this is more civics as an organic project of figuring out what it means to live together, rather than civics as being assimilated into a particular nation state and a particular set of practices. And my work tries to explore how these paradigms, these two paradigms of civic education, have drastically different implications for how we think about learning, youth, equity, and freedom. And my work tries to live in this tension of the question, can schools, public schools, which are institutions of the state, be places where expansive civic learning takes place? And I respond with a qualified and hopeful yes, I hope so. So there's a pattern that you might notice in the media. Attention to civic education tends to spike when a perceived threat to democratic structures emerge. In this case, Trump's election or the insurrection. And the proposed solution is usually that students simply need to learn more civics to mitigate the threats to these democratic systems. And there are usually some tacit assumptions that are present in this view. One view is that civics learning is a cognitive task focused on learning information, such as the three branches of government and separation of powers, as is reflected in things like the NAEP civics framework. We just need to learn more civic knowledge cognitively. We hear over and over again the deficit framing that young people today know less and do less civically than the before times. They are treated as not yet citizens. And I needed to put a star there because the term citizen itself is extremely problematic as a marker of legal status that excludes and marginalizes many of the students sitting in our classrooms. And the overarching theory of democratic progress here is that staying free means holding on to the systems that we have, the democracy that we currently have, which somehow will become more equitable as more people are granted access and inclusion into the structures we currently have. And I give a full critique of this normative approach to civics in a 2017 chapter in the Review of Research and Education that kind of goes into why this framing is just not working in terms of how young people participate today. Hard not to see me. But what if instead of seeing public challenges as an impetus for civic learning, we saw public challenges as the civic learning itself? Young people are learning civic lessons every single day from instances of white supremacist violence from the pandemic. These are some op-eds that I've written for Ed Week in the Washington Post, that we need to see the lives that young people are living as the real life civic education that they're receiving every single day, and use that as the basis of what it means to live in democracy. And these are obviously going to have different theories of learning. I'm thinking about integrated theories of learning, like the RISE framework. Folks that see social, historical, and cultural context as inseparable from the cognitive. We can't separate the learning of democracy from these other cultural contexts. And situating youth as complex and agentive historical actors. This context is one that critical race scholars have long shown us is systemically racist, very baked into the very institutions that structure democratic life. From this framing, freedom is not about maintaining or incrementally improving the structures that exist, but rather building new publics altogether. So Ruby talked a little bit about the work that I've been doing over the years that's kind of led to this, to the place that I've gotten to now. And so my work stands on the shoulders of scholars like the ones I've named and researchers in the civic world like Kathy Owen, Sean Ginwright, Joe Kahn, many others who have been grappling with what civic education means in a structurally inequitable society. During the first phases of my career, I explored critical sociocultural approaches to civics in a variety of related ways, all grounded in my years as a high school English teacher, and oriented now toward educating future teachers and future scholars. I spent 5 years coordinating the UCLA Council of Youth Research, analyzing the epistemology and methodology of youth participatory action research, or YPAR. I've critiqued apolitical approaches to social emotional learning through a model of critical civic empathy. I've explored how youth are remixing normative civic learning strategies like debate into a form of public pedagogy and public storytelling. And I've designed interventions to foster civic kinship in teacher education spaces, which is one of the things I'll talk about today. This is reflected in several of the books that I've written and involvement in the National Academy of Education's Civic Reasoning Project, led by Carol Lee, and writing reports about civic literacy for organizations like the National Council of Teachers of English. And every time I talk about this work, I always think it's really important to pause for a moment and name what it means for me personally, someone who benefits from immense unearned civic and academic privilege as a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman to be engaging in this kind of work. I'm constantly interrogating how to operate in relation with my colleagues and communities from a stance of solidarity, humility, and mutual kinship. This is a lifelong journey and takes different forms in different contexts. Sometimes it's about speaking up and taking on labor. Sometimes it's about sitting down and listening. It's about exposing the hidden curriculum of education and academia and creating fellowship as mentorship. And for me, ethically, it's always about collaborating, honoring folks through my citation practices and through the actual work of doing projects together. So I'm using individual pronouns today to talk about like my work, but that's kind of the conventions of this genre of me standing here alone giving a talk. But I want to make clear that everything that I talk about, all of the work that I'm going to be talking about, happens through collaboration with youth, with teachers, with colleagues, including my friend Antero Garcia. We obviously do a lot of work together, and we've been thinking a lot about how our model of partnership has been challenged a lot of times in the academy, but also is forging a new path about we don't need to do this work alone. And it's an intentional choice that's part of the framing of how I want to do research. So at this moment in my career, I've begun to pull these multiple threads together to offer new theoretical contributions to the field of civic education. And I believe that the way forward toward a just and liberatory future has always been lit by those who have been forced to the margins of civic life, by those in power. I've been thinking about the work of organizers and communities throughout history who have constructed counterpublics in the midst of oppression and theorized through the margins to agitate toward freedom. I'm specifically inspired by the proliferation of speculative art and culture and the articulations of indigenous, queer, Afro, Latinx, and Crip futurisms, showing us how we can recast the oppression of the past and present to dream of future worlds. Speculative theory is not fantasy or escapism. It is about who we can become when we detach ourselves from the structural common sense that is in the air we breathe. And that's one of the reasons that I had Station 11 music playing earlier. Not the book, I need to make that clear. There's a book called Station 11 that came out several years ago that people liked, but it got adapted into a 10-episode limited series for HBO. It came out during the pandemic, and I think it's one of the most meaningful pieces of speculative art that I've ever seen. I talk about it all the time. I got a tattoo of it, like I'm writing about it as educational philosophy. I think it's a vision of a world to come, and I talk about Station 11 everywhere I go. I go to HBO and watch it. And at the same time of looking at these speculative art movements, I'm also thinking about the field of critical literacy within education studies, critical literacy scholars in education who remind us of the power that we have to re-story our identities and public life and use our expressive repertoires to quite literally compose new worlds. So this has led to a few different pieces so far, and I know Ravit mentioned it. So this we first talked about this work in a 2020 article in the Harvard Education Review, so it was written before the pandemic started, and then I think the pandemic really kind of led to folks really thinking about this idea of creating new worlds, and then we expanded upon it in the AERJ piece that was distributed. And then we were fortunate enough to be able to, as Ravit said, be guest editors of a special issue of the Journal of the Learning Sciences, where learning scientists across the spectrum internationally are thinking about what speculation means. So that's a really cool issue to check out. There's also going to be a poster session coming up at AERA for anyone who's going, of all of the folks that wrote for the JLS issue and folks that wrote for an edited volume for Teachers College Press. So you can see like everyone in one space. It's going to be really cool. So speculative civic literacies. There's a lot to say about it. I'm going to kind of just go through the three major conceptual points about it, and then I'm going to try to explain what that means through a project called the Digital Democratic Dialogue Project. So speculative civic literacies as a framework centers everyday relations rather than the formal structures of the nation state as the starting point of civic education. Come on in. It designs from civic margins. It designs from the margins of civic life to iterate practices of social repair and social dreaming. And it insists upon joyful struggle in the midst of injustice in the continuing work of building worlds that are worthy of our aid. I just have to always stop and say this because every time I read this, this is an artist named Lauren Halsey. She lives in Los Angeles. Los Angeles has a piece of my heart, UCLA. So she is from South LA, and she represents her community, and she's a speculative artist that imagines her community in lots of different ways. And I love this quote that she said. I always say it because I think every time we talk about the speculative, it's having a moment right now when we think about things like Black Panther, like folks in pop culture are understanding this idea of the speculative, but people still think that if you speculate with young people, that means that you're just like dreaming of another world that we're never going to see. And it feels almost like you're retreating and being escapist. But this quote really gets into what I think is the core of speculation. She said, "I'm not interested in escapism. I'm interested in creating legible, real representations of who we were centuries ago or 5 minutes ago, and of who we can become 5 seconds from now or 100 years from now. I'm interested in drawing connections among multiple histories and collective experiences of neighborhoods to consider the here and now, as well as past and potential futures." So when I'm with my teacher education students and we're talking about becoming a teacher, I argue that speculation isn't something we have to just hope is going to happen like 50 years, 100 years from now when we're not around. The choices that we make as teachers every single day, and the choices we make as researchers in our scholarship are manifestations of speculation in the here and now. And we can't put it off until later. We could be doing that in our work right now through the disruptions that we make. So the 3D project, this paradigm kind of emerged from this research project that I've been spending a lot of time with. I did an initial round of data collection in the 2018-19 and 19-20 school years, supported by the Spencer Foundation. And now we're going through the 3D project continues with support from the National Council of Teachers of English. So we have a new round of data collection happening this year. And it's a community that basically doesn't end. It's going to be going on forever. Because once you start it, it's a family and it doesn't go anywhere. So it was originally designed as a collaborative of 6 teachers and their students, 228 students from 6 communities across the United States. And the purpose of the collaborative was to utilize digital communication tools to collapse the boundaries of time and space across this particular nation state and allow youth and teachers from demographically distinct communities to explore the roots of their civic identity, discuss the civic issues that matter to them, and dream of civic futures. There's so much to say about the study design that I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of it. So I'm happy to talk more about organizing a project like this, which the IRB alone in 6 different school districts and at Rutgers like almost killed me. But this was initially planned, like I said, as a 1-year project that has turned into an ongoing community. I purposely recruited English language arts teachers as an intentional move to disrupt civics from the silo of social studies alone. But we're getting to a place now where we want to open it up to all teachers across all subject areas, because one of the things that we argue is that all teachers are civics teachers, including science and math. And it's very important to me that the project be integrated into the school day within the content area instruction so that we can explore the possibilities and tensions of doing this work amid the constraints that we all face of formal school structures. I know what it's like to be a teacher and teach in spaces where I have mandates for different kinds of testing or different kinds of curriculum. So it'd be easy to do this after school in a space of freedom. But I, as a teacher educator, care about what it looks like to do this in the midst of a school day with everything else that teachers have to do. Also, it's very important to me that this is conceptualized as a social design-based experiment developed by one of my mentors, Chris Gutierrez, and extended by folks like Susan Giroux, Megan Bang, Shireen Basuji, and Saper Vakil, Social design-based research draws from cultural historical activity theory, participatory forms of inquiry, and a resilience thinking framework. The idea of social design-based experiments is that we transform the structures of learning environments rather than adapting individuals to those environments. So some of you might have heard of like RPPs or design research. And oftentimes in that kind of design research and education, the desire to solve problems of practice creates a situation where we use approaches or we come up with solutions that are bound by the logics of the very institutions that we're working within that perpetuate structurally inequity in the first place. So if we're thinking within the boundaries of what public schools are capable of, we're already being bounded by the logic of what they think is possible and what solutions they might have, which isn't going to get us to the social transformation. So social design-based experiments push us to not make existing structures do better, but to design new learning environments, honor how diverse communities of learners learn, and show new possibilities for being and doing together. I see this methodology as symbiotic with the theoretical framework of speculation and speculative civic literacies. It's still pretty new. Social design-based experimentation, as Chris Gutierrez explores it, is still pretty new in the field, and there's actually it hasn't come out yet, but another review of research of education, RRE, the 2023 volume hasn't come out yet. I don't know why, but it should be out like any day now. And Antero and I did a review of existing empirical research of social design-based experiments to try to argue, again, to push this forward as a methodology in the field. And this is our group of teachers early in the project as we were beginning to plan. So this is just kind of I'm going to zoom quickly through this. I'm happy to talk more about any of this later. Just to give you a sense, this was not meant to be a representative study in any way. I just wanted to play with some generative kinds of diversity across multiple indicators. So the 6 communities across the US that we started with were in the states of Texas, Colorado, Michigan, Pennsylvania, California, and Alaska. We had a mix of cities, suburbs, and towns as far as how the census would describe it. Teachers recruited 1 or more of their classes to participate, and they spanned from 9th through 12th grade. And if we're talking about more of these normative structures of political life, they existed in districts with different partisan representation and ideologies. So we looked up what the presidential vote in that zip code was, and just to get a very crude sense of what the different political communities might be like in these areas. This is very difficult to read, but it shows the self-identified racial identities of the student participants in relation to the percentages of those groups reported from the entire school's accountability data, just so you can see how these students were representative of their school. 2 of the schools had supermajorities of white students, 2 had supermajorities of Black students, and 2 enrolled students from a bit of a wider range of communities. So again, it's not trying to capture anything generalizable, just trying to have this interesting mix to see what would emerge from it. The new 6 schools that we now have are from different states around the country and different kind of groups of students. So we're trying to just continue to play with involving different communities from across the country. So obviously with this kind of level of this size of the study, I'll be writing about this for years and years. But for the purposes of today, I wanted to ask these 2 research questions or focus on these. So how do the 2 forms of civic education, one of lived experience and one of schooled instruction about the nature and workings of democracy, interact and influence youth and their teachers as they forge their own stances toward public life? And second, how can civic education in schools be redesigned to respond to students' experiences and foster the creativity needed to respond to intractable public challenges? We are in 2024. We have a presidential election coming up this year. I am filled with existential dread, but also with hope. I think this is going to be a really, really interesting and tough year in lots of ways to think about what the future of public life looks like. And so I want to be ready with young people to talk about that. I love this photo. Who needs fancy software for data analysis when you have poster paper and tape and Post-its? This was taken in the second summer retreat. So we were lucky to have some of that funding from the Spencer Foundation to bring all the teachers together from across the country before the project started. And then again, after the school year ended, which I think was such a valuable, that's a whole other thing we could talk about what's possible through the digital and what's possible when we're together physically. It was really important for the teachers to be together to reflect on the school year. These were ELA teachers, and I should mention that these are also all members of the National Writing Project, which is a community that's really close to my heart, a national network of teachers committed to the practice of writing for democratic life. So I intentionally wanted to design with teachers who already had commitments to this work to see what's possible. The first design cycle in the fall focused on how young people define civic community for themselves. The second design cycle on specific issues they wanted to dialogue about, and the third about the civic futures that they desired. And so you can start to see where we didn't have this framework of speculative civic literacies when we started. We just had this idea of future thinking. And as the course of the school year went on, this is where this idea, as you'll see, some of the things that happened led us to really think about creating this framework. Students communicated with each other through platforms often used in school. So at the time, we actually used Edmodo, RIP, Edmodo. It's gone, it died. So there's no more Edmodo. But we used them outside of their stated institutional purposes. And teachers found ways to integrate the project activities and the design cycles into their existing curriculum. This chart shows the multiple civic activity systems that were in play during the year. So the teachers actually made different kind of overlapping timelines that were happening at the same time. So such as the national and international events that went on during the school year, as well as things that happened in their local communities and things that were mandates in their schools, things that happened in their own personal lives, and what happened in our team. And all of them influenced the course of the project. And these also correspond to all the different rounds of coding that we engaged in together. I should also mention another part of this is that we have never been able to find, even now doing this project again, we have not been able to find any digital tools or platforms that actually support doing this work. We've had to always do workarounds because most of the digital tools that are made for schools just replicate schooling. So it's been really hard to find platforms to have students share multimodal work with each other while protecting their identities as we're required to by IRB. But they want to talk, and it's very hard to find ways to get that many kids to talk. Most platforms aren't really built to allow them to do that, except in a very schooled way like Google Classroom, or something like that. So data collection involved multiple strands. We had the 2 summer retreats. We met monthly on Zoom. We had a Slack channel that still goes now. We Slack all the time. And I was able to travel to each community to spend time in their classrooms. There were thousands of digital artifacts produced over the course of 1 year in the form of discussion threads, curriculum materials, student-produced texts. There were interviews, there were focus groups, there were surveys with students and teachers. The exact numbers are all like ARJ had a field day with all the methodology. So that section is where I really learned how to write a really strong methodology section to talk about all of it. Today, I just want to go directly into some of the student dialogues that occurred in Design Cycle 2 to talk about the tension between this school, civic education, and sociocultural. So 228 students formed online discussion groups to talk about a particular civic issue of their choosing after they'd gotten to know each other. There were 30 groups operating simultaneously, focused on 14 different topics that they identified. The 2 most popular topics that students wanted to discuss reflect the challenges that are dominating our civic life today. The first most popular challenge they wanted to discuss was guns, and the second was gender. Now remember that the teachers had purposely spent the entire first design cycle, so the entire fall of the school year, supporting students to share their identities with each other, because we believed that if we had relationships, it could foster the kinds of civic dialogue that we were hoping for. There were photo essays, we did all kinds of amazing stuff. There was all kinds of vulnerable connection. The students were getting to know each other. They were obviously finding each other on social media outside of our project, which is cool. So we then thought that the argumentation would start from a different place to talk about issues than if we just kind of threw them into what most teachers do, which is like to create debates. But when the dialogues started in the winter, the teachers immediately sensed a challenge, and it's one that I confirmed during later analysis of 372 dialogue exchanges in the group. And I'm going to show you an example of one in a moment. But basically what happened is that the shift from discussing experiences, personal experiences, to discussing a public issue seemed to create a corresponding shift in student discourse from storytelling to academic argumentation. While teachers were hoping to illuminate a bridge from the personal to the civic, students seemed to automatically adjust their register when it came time for civic talk. And by academic argumentation moves, I'm talking about things like claims, evidence from credentialed sources, and warrants, the kinds of moves that rhetoric scholars in the 1980s introduced, which forms the basis of essay writing that we still do today on all of our standardized tests in every English classroom in every state in this country. And these are the kind of moves that teachers are encouraged to instill in students as indicative of objective or good civic conversation. So to be brief, the great majority of student dialogues began with academic argumentation moves. And when students responded with further argumentation, which is what they mostly did, the conversations quickly petered out. Because as we know, if any of us are spending any time online, It's really tiring to engage in arguments online, and when it starts, most people just pull away and don't want to do it anymore, and we don't talk anymore. So this is one example of what happened in the group, one of the groups discussing guns. One student immediately characterized the conversation as a debate, even though the teachers constantly attempted to create an alternative framing, and it made me laugh because they immediately thought that if you get together to discuss anything civic, like, hello, like, I'm happy to be joining you in this debate. That must be what we're doing. And that created a ping pong effect. So students did what they had been taught in school and society that they should do. They got evidence on both sides of the argument to support their claim. In this case, one argument for gun control, and one against gun control. And I'll also note that this it haunts me to this day because this was before the pandemic that this conversation started. And the student took a quote from Elizabeth Warren, who said, "We lose 8 children and teenagers to gun violence every day. If a mysterious virus suddenly started killing 8 of our children every day, America would mobilize teams of doctors and public health officials. We would move heaven and earth until we found a way to protect our children, but not with gun violence." And it gives me a chill because then the pandemic happened and we found that we are willing to accept the death of a great many children and adults around the world for the purposes of moving forward. And I'm like, ooh, this is creepy. But when we saw this starting to happen, we thought, all right, what do we do here? There's a case to be made that some people would make in the field of civic learning, that students need to be taught more about how to analyze sources, how to evaluate evidence, and how to craft persuasive claims in order to engage in a nuanced civic conversation about gun policy, one that we could perhaps do in our legislative system in Congress. I'm thinking about a lot of the work in civic online reasoning, Sam Weinberg, Stanford Education Group, misinformation studies, and all that is important. And it's a necessary piece of the puzzle. But for me, I think there's something else going on that's different and important to also to do. And that, for me, was exemplified through the story of one particular student named Corey. He was an 11th grader from our Alaska group who identified as a white male. The teachers often talked about Corey because of his approach to the project and his discussion with his peers. He was in one of the gender discussion groups instead of the gun group. And this is one example from a field note. Corey posted in response to one student, "I can rebuttal some of your other points if you would like." When Sarah, a 9th grader from Texas, attempted to initiate a new exchange by sharing a personal story of her perceived experience of being discriminated against by a coach during a basketball game because of her gender, a complex thread began to emerge of other self-identified girls sharing stories of their microaggressions that they had experienced. And in response, Corey replied, "But you didn't really provide an example." Corey repeatedly relished the competitive aspects of argumentation. He rejected personal experience as a valid source of civic knowledge, while sharing multiple links about gender from websites such as PragerU, Prager University, which is a right-wing site that explicitly, in their words, offers a free alternative to the dominant left-wing ideology in culture, media, and education. Corey's teacher, Lacey, informed the group that this was not a situation in which learning about misinformation or the logical fallacies of his claims was going to be effective with him. Evidence of why can be seen in what Corey shared during the first design cycle. So Corey shared earlier in the year that the 2 cultural communities that mattered most in his life were those of his Mormon faith and Republican politics. In a series of reflections throughout the design cycle, we could see the increasingly complex relationship between Corey's civic identity and his use of argument. At first, he tried to separate the two. "I do not enjoy talking about myself and would rather argue a point." But as he moved further into peer interactions, the separation began to erode. "I have learned to express my opinions and am able to effectively communicate them to someone with opposing viewpoints. This is crucial to my identity because as I gain confidence in my opinions and gather facts to support them, I gain confidence in myself, which is an essential aspect of identity." And by the end of the cycle, he found explicit support for his identity in argument. "I had strong convictions that were only solidified through research and the process of gathering facts." I argue that while we could certainly spend time problematizing the accuracy or the quality of Corey's arguments, the deeper issue is that Corey is committed to particular information sources because they are integral to his developing sense of civic selfhood. He's leveraging the skills of schooled civic education, schooled argumentation as a shield to support him. Joe Kahn has written about ideological commitments to misinformation, and I suggest that teaching Corey the flaws in his reasoning will not address the deeper cultural issues at play here. Issues that ended up stifling the sort of vulnerable perspective taking that could speak to a different model of world building civic dialogue across social difference. That's not what he was going for. And again, the teacher team was recognizing these tensions in the moment, and they were iteratively developing responses to them during our planning meetings. They shared what they talked about with their students. So we would have these planning meetings, and then they would go in and have the same conversations with their students. And together, we all examined what we thought was going well and what was not going well in these dialogues. The students recognized a difference in the connections that they felt across the communities during the first design cycle and the second. And one element they pointed to as causing the difference was storytelling. There was a lot of it in the first design cycle, and it began to fall away during the second one. And in response, the teachers created a scaffold for students to use in an attempt to do civic dialogue differently, called the 4 Cs. Students returned to their dialogues seeking to embody values of care, connection, communication, and curiosity. So what you see here could look like, at first glance, another example of ping pong argumentation moves. But because of the deeper design work, these were actually the catalyst for a deeply vulnerable dialogue that happened between 2 students in that gun group that I mentioned earlier. These were created by Brandon and Marcus. Brandon, who is white, lived in a small town in far northern California and shared a personal photo to demonstrate the role that guns played in his life as a tool. Marcus, who is Black, lived in a large city in Pennsylvania and shared a personal photo of a neighborhood memorial to demonstrate the effect of gun violence in his life. These photos and the storytelling that accompanied them, buttressed by the connections that they had already made through the first design cycle of actually getting to know each other and chatting with each other, opened up a dialogic space for a little while in which the 2 of them asked each other questions about their experiences and tried to understand the civic space that they were both occupying in this country, but from such different points of view. And I don't argue in any way that there's lasting effects that this interaction was going to have on Brandon or Marcus's stance on gun policy, because that wasn't the purpose, to try to change someone's stance or to have them act a certain way in terms of our normative structures of like voting. It was a moment like the veil of talking points lifted to reveal a brief glimpse into an alternative world in which the bounds of community shifted and critical civic empathy could flourish for a moment. Marcus reflected on the dialogue and said, it's kind of surreal because it's kind of like, hey, there are people there outside of you, and there are people that exist and have lives and have experiences that aren't you. And that's kind of weird to think about. So seeing these other people and reading about the experiences they've had, it's very eye-opening. I suggest that civic education, starting from this point, one of centering relations between people, is the potential start of a journey toward a speculative revisioning of public life. We saw moments like this emerging and subsiding across all the groups over time. Students that were willing to make a conceptual shift towards something different than just argumentation. This is not an either or. It's not like speculative is on one side and engaging with current politics is on the other side. We're not arguing that our students should not engage with the systems we currently have, but that our vision, our horizon needs to go beyond simply getting students to pay attention to the news and to think about the kind of world that they want to be building together. It's a both and. How do we materially improve people's lives and foster equity today in the world that we have, but without letting that be the horizon of what is possible? It matters that disproportionate effects of gun violence are felt in Marcus's community more than in Brandon's community, amid a national context of systemic racism and urban disinvestment. Speculative is not about not allowing the limit of civic horizons to be the structures that we currently see around us, but demanding more. And I think that it's insulting to see youth civic dreaming as frivolous for them to dream, because they very much live in a reality with civic dread all around them that comes from a refusal for our current civic structures to take meaningful action on issues like gun violence. Just as the students in our Colorado group were beginning to really open up about the impact of guns on their lives, some in really heartrending ways, like the story of this particular student, the discussion points suddenly stopped coming. And that was because the entire school district in Colorado canceled classes because there was a threat of an active shooter in the community. And in the weeks afterwards, a spate of unrelated gun violence took the lives of several young people in the community where the students go to school in Colorado. Before this happened, the students were setting up Zoom calls, and this is before we all were on Zoom. So this was like very exciting at the time to be on Zoom. They wanted to see each other's faces and show each other their schools. So we actually had some students walking around the hallways with computers so that the students could see the hallways that they were all walking through. Afterwards, Sasha, the teacher, noted, my class got so excited about the Zoom calls and imagining something with a big group of people from all over the country. But after everything that happened, they were like, can we just finish the year? Like, I don't want to do this anymore. Civic despair lives alongside civic hope. For every breakthrough, there's another tragedy. The speculative frame acknowledges this struggle rather than the normative approach to civics that assumes that more knowledge and commitment to voting will reform the systems that young people have seen continue to exist over time and are not being dealt with. So there's all kinds of pushes and pulls about in design cycle 3. I won't talk about too much right now so that we can talk, but the students and teachers did find a way to end the year dreaming of civic futures beyond despair and exhaustion. They decided to play a bit by imagining civic superheroes who could leverage magic to address the challenges that our current public institutions consistently struggle to address. You can see here that their creations are laser focused on the very issues that are stalking them into adulthood. Not only gun violence, but also climate change, hunger, and housing. Again, because of the design context, our team interpreted this not as an exercise in escapism, but rather a creative interrogation of the status quo and a catalyst for speculative demands in the present. And again, this is like an entirely different phase of this whole thing, like a entirely different set of articles, but the 3D project meant so much, not just as a site of youth civic learning, but also as a reparative, personal, and professional community for the teachers that were involved. As you can likely gather from the data shared thus far, this experience was an extremely intense one for the teachers professionally, emotionally, and interpersonally. They described it as one outside the realm of what they expected they would do and feel as part of a research study. As Isabel, the teacher from Pennsylvania, noted, I did not think this research group would really be a community. I did not see any way my future was really bound up with anyone else's when we started. Each teacher broke something open in me in a way I'd forgotten I could feel. There's a lot to say about social design-based experimentation as a model for teacher education, which is something that I'm interested in moving forward. This is also why the project doesn't end, because this community is now a family. When we started the second design year in the 1920s school year, we were just getting off the ground when the pandemic shut everything down. And we joked together about how, like, what happens to the project? Is this the end of the project? And we were like, of course not. Like, this project can't end because we are just together. So the teachers, we gathered every month on Zoom and we cried together and we dealt with the fallout of the pandemic together. And they are now the mentors of the next group of new teachers that have come in. And the idea is that the community just continues to grow and this community doesn't end as a research project. And we were happy to see that when we tried to get teachers to join from the NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English Network, we had like over 100 teachers apply to try to, for like 6 spots that we have in this network. We're trying to think about what it means to scale this up without losing the intimacy that makes it so important. So it's really, we're trying to see it as a model maybe for a different kind of civic education in schools. So I think that the 3D project is maybe one step on the pathway toward a model of speculative civic education that does not start from a place of assimilating young people into the flawed democratic structures that exist, but rather asking them to design the society they want to live in, asking questions about why we don't live there yet, and then figuring out what it would take to do so. I think we need to stop siloing civic education into one content area. Instead, help researchers, teachers, and policymakers to operate from the standpoint that all learning is civics learning across subjects, across grade levels. Social studies obviously has a key role to play here. My social studies friends often get like very upset when I say this because they're afraid that this is going to get like taken away from them. But they have an important role to play. But the choices that every teacher makes every day about their discipline and about the relationships in their classrooms is envisioning particular civic forms of life. And we can be intentional about that to change our planning and our instruction. And then I just want to highlight the role of literacy, art, and play in the building of new civic relationships, and between young people in the classroom and between researchers and communities can change the way we work in academic spaces. So for the K-12 aspect of this, I have the book that just came out a few months ago called Civics for the World to Come. I was trying to take the kind of more academic-y work here of this 3D project and turn it into something that teachers could actually use in a little more friendly way, not so theoretical heavy. And so the book translates the theory of speculative civic literacies into an approach to classroom instruction. And we call it world building civic commitments. It asks every teacher to consider the question, what world is your teaching building? And then offer concrete planning strategies around 5 different commitments. And there's like all the different communities that I've worked with over the years, from the Council of Youth Research to the 3D project, to the debate team, to the Black Cloud project, which is a science project in LA. We tell the stories of all those communities in the book to talk about concepts of inquiry, imagination, advocacy, networking, and storytelling as being commitments that all teachers can work toward building that new form of civic life. So that's where I am right now, and I'm going to stop so that we can talk. Straightforward.
Do we have any questions on Zoom?
No questions on Zoom.
All right, so just, if anyone on Zoom wants to ask a question, just do so in the chat, but I'm gonna, first of all, thank you so much, Nicole, this was, so rich, and thought-provoking and beautiful in lots of ways, and I have a ton of questions, but I will shut up, and open the floor up for other people. I do not see other people.
I also have 1,000 questions, so you probably knew that. I guess one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in my own work is just it's important we're talking the students were choosing topics that were deeply personal, important to them, like that's part of the goal, but then with that comes a lot of like emotional weight and baggage. So I'm wondering, like, how did either the educators or researchers help students navigate those moments of tension that like had to arise when these issues were so deeply personal for students?
Part of it is that before, so basically the students, I pulled everybody across the different sites to see what they wanted to talk about, and then I was organizing everyone into these groups. And then before the students could even begin engaging in any kind of dialogue, we had a protocol where all the students in any particular group had to go back to design cycle 1, which I didn't get to share too much of, but students created photo essays and writing whatever they wanted to create, multimodal posts about just who am I, how do I see community, like what are the tensions I see, what I care about. And that was so personal and like vulnerable that it created this really amazing space that the students were just like, wow, I never, they just started talking. Some people talked about their personal interests, some talked about their family. And so it kind of took away that whole online, like just a nameless avatar. They actually got to know who these folks were, and they had to go back to that first design cycle and look at each other's posts again and just have like normal conversation before switching into talking about anything serious. And even doing that still meant that the discomfort arose, but there was a sense of built-in respect and care that had already been established for each other. And they were going into it with the teacher's guidance of leaning into discomfort and talking about the difference between discomfort and safety. We knew that safety was a non-negotiable. Everyone has to feel safe in the space. And we had to, as the adults, monitor all of these discussion groups just to make sure, you never know, things can go off the rails. So we were always watching, but we also let them, and all the teachers were having conversations with the students in their classrooms about what does it mean to make sure that you feel safe, but what does it mean when you feel a little uncomfortable? And how is that okay to feel as long, and what do we do with it? And that's where the scaffolding of the 4 Cs came from. And it came to a place where the students were so excited to be talking to real human beings that were real like teenagers that like them, but different, that they went into it with a sense of like empathy and care that I was really, I'm always impressed by. So I think they found a lot of the ways to get through it because of the fact, and it was intentional to make sure that we don't talk about these issues until we actually know each other, because that's part of the relations. If we all see each other as in this together, and you can't just like yell at them as like a nameless bot on Twitter, then it got us to a different place. And because they trusted their teachers. So it just felt like a community where that was safe.
Can you talk more about how you I don't know how to say it, got the 4 Cs going in classrooms? So it's a scaffold, but how did you introduce it? How did you help them learn it and use it?
It first emerged from, so again, this was coming from seeing what was going on with Corey and a few other examples of like, oh, this isn't need the debating. And the teachers during one of our Zoom meetings, we just started throwing ideas around about like, this feels wrong. And that's where we came to the four concepts. And then because we always wanted the teachers to iterate it in a way that made sense in their own context, I said, why don't you all like take a moment now and go back to how would you introduce this to your students? And they all talked about a strategy they would use. And then we basically put them all together and created like it's not a lesson plan because we weren't doing lesson plans. It wasn't that kind of structured academic talk, but it was about creating a protocol where they then would have students go back to the conversations that they personally had been engaged in, and had students look at whether or not they felt like they engaged in care, community, curiosity, and if or not. And once they analyzed their own talk, then they were able to think about what they would do differently. And it kind of like set a reset moment for everybody's dialogues where they just restarted from a place of like, I'm not trying to convince you of anything anymore. And so there was a whole protocol that I could share that we developed together on a Zoom call that the teachers then built out and shared on Slack and in our Google Drive that they then introduced to each of their classrooms that we then came back and then iterated again and changed. It was important that they all didn't just use one. We never created like one thing that everyone used because we wanted each teacher to have the freedom to adapt it and remix it for their own personal use, if that makes sense.
I have a question building up on that, and I think also some of what Ellen mentioned around the building care, because the relationship and the care and is really critical here. And I'm wondering about as you were talking, it struck me that they could look at their conversations and think about whether they embodied care because those were captured in print. And I'm wondering, what are the implications of the materiality of doing this in ways, there's text-based? What happened or were there conversations that were not text-based? And if they were, how did they reflect or think about care in those? And in environments where there may not be text-based, so for example, college classes where we might see them once a week and not, how might one support care and sort of this deep praxis around it?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating part of like, we never got to the place where we had a dream, obviously, of bringing everyone together in person, like all the students, but that we're not that many yet. We need like big NSF money. So we couldn't bring everyone together personally. So they did always have, and we never got to the full Zoom. We had some Zoom conversations, but not about civic issues in particular. So they were able to have the moment to reflect on having something like posted for a second and like, let me think and do some like reflection before I respond. If it was happening in the moment where like things get heated in a classroom space, that definitely creates like a different set of challenges. I've been thinking about what that means with the teachers were all thinking about that in their own classrooms. And I think about what it means to take, we do norms and norm setting is very important, but what it means to like live those norms and figure out what it means to like hit that stop button when a heated thing happens in the middle of class. I think all of us that teach are always thinking about that. And so I think I'm not sure what would happen if the students were doing it and how to make yourself reflect on that scaffold in the moment while you're talking out loud. I could maybe imagine ways we would reflect on body language or reflect on meta conversations where we pause and like think about it, like our embodied, like how are we feeling right now? But I'd be really curious to see what would happen if we took it to that next level. Yeah.
So I have a kind of meta question, just thinking about doc students online and here, or early career people. Your work cuts across so many different spaces, like literacy, civics, learning sciences. How do you think about positioning like yourself within those spaces? Do you feel like you have one kind of home community you kind of branch out for? But I'm just thinking about people whose work kind of cuts across a lot of different things and how they can kind of position themselves successfully kind of for a career and kind of where they want to be.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I always thought of myself, I still don't think of myself as a learning scientist at all. I think it's like, I'm like,
But you are.
passing in that area. I think it comes from, for those of us that are your doctoral students right now, it feels like you're learning a particular field, like they feel like they're these separate places and you belong in one of them. And so I'm a literacy person. I will always be, literacy is my home. But I think reading across, and that's why it's so important during coursework when you have the time to like read across different communities and realize that we're all saying similar, there's, that moment you realize that we're all saying similar things. We just have different jargon for it and different approaches to it and different slight focus areas. And so for me, the National Writing Project and NCTE and the literacy community was always accepting and welcoming of this idea of talking about civic learning within literacy through sociopolitical stuff. But as I realized that we were engaging more and more with civics and that teachers were coming who were from social studies, and so I was like, all right, well, what are they reading over there? And then we start to read their journals, figure out what their kind of like ways of routines and ways of doing things are, and figuring out what piece of what I do can I do to speak to that audience, and then what's going on with the learning sciences community, and then can I start going maybe 1 year to one of their conferences to hear what's going on, and then get invited to maybe do something with that community. That's where I think through Chris and through others was where how the intersection with the learning sciences community kind of came about. And to hear that you start to see who the people are that are having similar conversations across those spaces, and then bringing everyone together. So we're always tempted to apply for big grants that are about doing a particular project, but I thought it was really, it took the work to the next level when we applied for a Spencer conference grant. So I love conference grants. I think they're great because we actually had money then to bring people together from these different communities to all get in the same place and just walk together. And that's where the origin of the JLS issue came from. That's where speaking to these different audiences came from, bringing people together, have a moment to talk across these silos. So as much as possible, I think getting into those different spaces is a way that I felt like I now can, and I look at each journal and figure out what slice of the work am I going to talk about in each space.
Wondering, I was thinking something that I imagine is important about speculative futures, or kind of imagining speculative futures, is for the students to feel like this is something that actually could happen in a sense. And I'm wondering if you have a sense from students' conversations, what they thought was, what they took away from this as something that could really happen in the future, and what they took away from it as like some cool thing that we did in class and that will stay in our class and not go beyond there.
Yeah, that tension is real. And that's why like the first thing we wrote about this was that article, we called it "I Hesitate, but I Do Have Hope" was the name of the first article. And that was a quote from a student at the end of the year. Because when you have like these little ephemeral communities that pop up, but then the rest of their school day and the rest of school systems aren't really supporting this kind of thinking, then it can just seem like a drop in the bucket, and it can seem demoralizing. But I think there's that mix of like, for the first part, if you haven't seen this article, it just came out a few days ago in the New York Times. There's like reports about the big surveys about how youth right now like are completely like disillusioned by like high school, by their possibilities in civic life. It was a really depressing set of survey findings that just came out. But to me, I don't see it as completely depressing. I see it as hopeful, because I think young people today sitting in our classrooms know that like things are not right. And we just, after the pandemic, snapped right back into doing school, double down the way that school used to be, after having those conversations about how it was going to be a portal into like a new way of being, that it was never going to be the same, but we got scared and the systems are powerful, and we just came back to doing school like double time. And kids are sitting there, and anyone that's in schools right now, kids know that it's not working, and most of the teachers know that it's not working, but it's like, so I think it's frustrating because we have things like this where they're allowed to dream, and there is a little bit of doubt that is going to be there, and dread, and like not knowing if we actually are going to make any changes when they see the systems around them, like around gun control. People continue to die and nothing changes. So there's a real sense of like, struggle and like despair that is part of it. But I also think that the young people have faith, and I hate when people romanticize young people to say like, this generation won't put up with it, because that's not fair. Like they're having to deal with a lot, but I do feel like they see elements of when they can see across communities and start to feel a network and start to feel like they're part of a struggle, and a struggle that moves one step forward and two steps back, but continues to find meaning in just trying. That's where I think I find a lot of hope. And that's where I've always found hope in YPAR, because a lot of people argue like, when you do YPAR, doesn't it make kids cynical when they find that you go out and do a study and you want changes, and then like the systems don't change? Isn't that demoralizing? But students often don't find it demoralizing at all. They understand that they are now part of you have a purpose to like, maybe I will not see the changes that I want to see in my lifetime, which is depressing, but I'm part of a meaningful life of actually like striving for them together in relation with joy and despair at the same time. So that's kind of like that weird, it's a sad, but also where I find hope, because if you work with kids, you're not allowed to seed hope. That's our job. So I feel like that's where I've been like ruminating on what that means as I spend time in schools watching kids that are getting the same kind of instruction for a world that is completely different, and how urgent it is to do something different.
There any other there's nothing on the Zoom right now? Any other last lingering questions? We can probably take one more, but we are theoretically at time. We want to make sure everyone has a chance.
And I'm around, you'll find.
And that's all we have around.
I'm here.
So thank you.
Thank you.
This has been really inspiring. I enjoyed every minute. I'm sure everyone else did. And thank you for sharing this really Herculean piece of, it's not even a piece, right? Like this effort of